The Three Disciplines of Stoicism, a guide for living a life of meaning and intention. Philosophers Massimo Pigliucci and Lopez discuss how Stoicism can help us gain perspective on our emotions and act with intention in the world. Key takeaways. Stoicism has become incredibly popular in the last decade. The three disciplines of Stoicism teach us how to step back, act with intention, and improve our relationship with the world. For Stoicism to be a philosophy of life, it's not enough to make one's life better. A Stoic must make the world a better place for others, too. How does a person live a good, meaningful life? Many schools of philosophy and religion have attempted to answer this important question. The result of their efforts is a long history of diverse beliefs and etiquettes, some of which have aged incredibly well, others of which not so much. Stoicism is one such school of philosophy, and while its heyday appeared to have ended 2,000 years ago, it may in fact just be getting started. Founded by Zeno of Citium in the 3rd century BC, Stoicism unified logic, ethics, and metaphysics into a coherent philosophy of life. The school would evolve throughout the Hellenistic period and, like so much of Greek culture, would eventually migrate to the Roman Empire. There, it found some of its most well-known and influential voices, the former slave Epictetus, the statesman Seneca, and the philosopher King Marcus Aurelius. Stoicism would decline around the time Christianity became the empire's state religion, though it would continue to influence thinkers such as Justus Lipsius, Baruch Spinoza, and Immanuel Kant, but its lengthy hibernation would lead to a surprising awakening around the middle of the 20th century. Today, Stoicism is booming. Print sales of Aurelius' Meditations, Seneca's Letters from a Stoic, and all things Epictetus are way up. The philosophy has become the subject du jour of newsletters, podcasts, Instagram feeds, self-help blogs, and quote devotionals proliferating the internet. But what's different about this modern Stoicism from its ancient counterpart? How can we separate the philosophy of life from the life hacks and quickie-pop Stoicism? And what, if anything, can Stoicism say about living a meaningful life in the modern world? I recently spoke with Lopez, the founder of the New York City Stoics Meetup and co-founder of the Stoic Fellowship, and Massimo Pigliucci, professor of philosophy at the City College of New York and author of How to Be a Stoic, to discuss these questions as well as explore the three disciplines of Stoicism. Kevin, what brought you both to Stoicism? Considering how many schools of philosophy there are, why this one? Greg would say luck played a role. I was practicing Buddhism in the early aughts, and it led me to volunteer for an organization that taught cognitive behavioral therapy to people with addictive behaviors. The cognitive therapy that they trained us in as group facilitators was called rational emotive behavior therapy. I learned that the founder of that therapy, Albert Ellis, was heavily influenced through Stoicism. When I saw that philosophy could be practical for something, first of all, my mind was blown. I took a metaphysics class, and I thought philosophy was for constructing trilemmas about ontological issues. That you could actually use philosophy was crazy. That they were doing it 2,500 years ago, even crazier. I looked around the internet and found very small groups of people trying to practice Stoicism, and so I decided to found New York City Stoics in 2013 as essentially a reading group. Then one day, Massimo came to the group, and our paths collided. Massimo, I went through a pretty standard midlife crisis, both in terms of my life and academic career. I switched from biology to the philosophy of science, and since I was studying philosophy as a PhD student at the time, I thought that if there's an answer available to life's questions other than religious ones, which I had abandoned when I was a teenager, that has to come from philosophy. So, I studied in a more or less systematic way. I began with Buddhism, but didn't get very far because it just wasn't speaking to me. From there, I zoomed into virtue ethics. I started with Aristotle, he didn't speak to me. I moved on to Epicurus, and he did speak to me on several levels, but there were major things that I couldn't go along with. I was in this process of exploration when I saw a tweet that said, "Help us celebrate Stoic Week." I thought, what the hell is Stoic Week, and why would anybody want to celebrate it? Laughs. Because at the time, I thought it meant the stiff upper lip, Mr. Spock type. Why would anybody want to do that? Then I realized the Stoics meant Marcus Aurelius, and I read the Meditations in college. The Stoics meant Seneca, and I had translated Seneca from the Latin in high school. I never thought they were actually talking about the same thing. So I gave it a try, and here we are a few years later. Feeling like a new Stoic. Kevin, the title of your co-authored book is A Handbook for New Stoics. What is new about New Stoicism compared to the Stoicism of, say, Zeno, Seneca, and Epictetus? Massimo, there is disagreement about what New Stoicism means, perhaps predictably. Just like there was disagreement among the early Stoics. This is not a religion, and even if it were a religion, religious people disagree how to interpret their texts. Let alone philosophers. Massimo, one of the authors that influenced me in recent years is Larry Becker, who wrote a book titled The New Stoicism. And Larry proposed a thought experiment. Let's suppose that Stoicism continued past the 2nd century and responded to developments in philosophy and science throughout the centuries. What would that look like today? My answer is that from the ethical perspective, it wouldn't look very different. We would have essentially the same ethics, with some caveats. From the point of view of metaphysics, it would look somewhat differently. The early Stoics were materialists. They believed everything was made of stuff. But they also believed that the universe was a sentient being endowed with something called the logos, and that wouldn't stand with our modern understanding of what the universe is like. So the Stoics would have updated that. In fact, they were very open to change as long as new information came about. One example is that the early Stoics thought the control center of what we'd call the mind was the heart. Then later on, anatomists discovered it was probably the brain. So, the Stoics said, okay, it's the brain. We'll go with the facts and not a priori knowledge. Finally, there is logic. The Stoics were good logicians, very practical. And I think they would take on board everything that's coming out of cognitive and behavioral science. Things like cognitive biases research. All of that could easily be incorporated into the system and updated. I'm curious to hear Greg's answer. Man is disturbed not by things, but by the views he takes of them. Epictetus. I would point out that the book's title is also a double entendre. It's New Stoicism for people who are not currently practicing and to answer the question of what a modern kind of Stoicism would be. I see. Overall, I believe that the modern Stoics can and should update their core ethics from the facts of how the world seems to work to us now. And the Stoics had several metaphors for how the 3 parts of theoretical philosophy interrelate. My favorite is that of a field where logic is the fence to keep the animals out. Physics is the soil from which ethics, the crop, actually grows. So, you want to harvest the ethics, but what to do with one's life depends on the kind of world we live in and the kind of beings we are. How we figure that out best is through the protection of good reasoning and logic. I think that leads to some different conclusions from the ancient Stoics. We don't believe the soul is a mix of fire and air, nor should we. We've moved on from that. But we can keep the spirit of Stoicism alive while adjusting beliefs and facts based on a modern understanding. Massimo, one more thing, this isn't just about the Stoics. Every other philosophy or religion has updated itself over the centuries. It's just that normally if you're talking about Buddhism or Christianity, the process has been so slow and so piecemeal that you almost don't realize it. But it's not like somebody is a Christian today in the same way they were 2,000 years ago. No matter what they profess, they don't actually believe the same things. And rightly so. In the case of Stoicism, it's a little more jarring only because there is no analogous continuity. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same scenario. The equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius on the Capitoline Hill, Rome. Aurelius was a Roman emperor and the last of the 5 good emperors. His personal journal was originally a means for him to practice his Stoic philosophy of life and has since become a Stoic textbook commonly titled Meditations. Credit, Filippo Montefort/AFP via Getty Images. The Fundamental Rule of Life. Kevin, good point. One more question to lay the groundwork. What is the dichotomy of control? You call it the central concept in Stoicism, and the book's subtitle, Thriving in a World Out of Your Control, points to its importance. What do our readers need to know about it to better understand Stoicism? The biggest thing is that it's easily misunderstood and misapplied. Yep. The Greek is not saying things are in your control and things aren't. It's actually what's up to you and what's not. What can you actually choose to do as opposed to what's happening or what's the outcome? That's the most important thing. I would also add a couple of ways of misunderstanding it or abusing it. If people simply focus on the dichotomy of control as the be-all end-all of Stoicism, they're cutting Stoicism short because it falls firmly within the first discipline of Epictetus, which is the discipline of desire. That's only the first step. You then move on to the discipline of action, which is how to become a good person. If you don't add that second step, then you're losing half or even more of Stoicism. Massimo, I agree. Recently, I have made a point of not using the phrase, dichotomy of control, because it is open to people saying, it's not just the things I control and can't control, but there are also things I can influence. Yes, I know. That is why it's not about control. Pierre Hardot, the French scholar that arguably did the most in the 1990s to bring back the whole notion of a practical philosophy of life, actually refers to it as the fundamental rule of life. Another thing, as Greg pointed out, is that too many people focus on the fundamental rule as though it were encapsulating Stoicism. But too much focus on the fundamental rule is what separates a philosophy of life from what I, derisively, I admit, refer to as life hackery.